welcome to the Keen Yoga podcast. Today it's just me again, coming to you, in fact, from sunny Tenerife. So, been in Frankfurt last week teaching, lovely time, not such great weather, and now in Tenerife, waiting for the Purple Valley retreat to kick off, and very nice weather. In fact, too hot almost, which is crazy at this time of May, especially as an English person. You just can't really believe that any country can have consistently nice weather. So, anyway, if you want to catch me anywhere else in Europe this summer and fall, I'm doing a number of retreats, a number of workshops in different cities, and you can see my whole schedule on the website or probably on social media or, probably everywhere you turn. So I hope to see you somewhere. And if I don't, then maybe in the future, right? Anyway, today I'm going to talk about what kind of practice are we doing in yoga. So this is an interesting one, so please stay tuned. And next week you'll have someone else with me. But today I want to talk about what we are actually doing these days in modern yoga practice. Are we doing Patanjali's yoga, for example? Because I think we're very keen on the Yoga Sutras, which I often come back to, right? This Yoga Sutras is almost the seminal text of the modern yoga practitioner. But does it really reflect our current aims and aspirations? Are we practicing Patanjali's yoga, right? Whether we're doing Ashtanga yoga or not, right? Because first of all, Patanjali doesn't really talk much about asana. Yeah, there's literally a few sutras in the Sadhana Pada, right, the second chapter. But, they're not really talking about dynamic asanas, right? He's in the commentary, the commentary with his Vyasa, not his Vyasa. Sometimes he's said to be Vyasa, in fact. But Vyasa does detail the asanas that are used there. And, I think there's about 12 of them. None of them are dynamic in nature. None of them are connected by movements. They certainly wouldn't be practiced as a couple of hour practice, for example, in exclusion of anything else. I think they're just, if anything, they're probably, as is often said, a seat for meditation is the main part. It doesn't seem that they're kind of energetic. It's just simply a steady seat for meditation, as the root as is often said to mean, asana, a seat for meditation. So, yes, it doesn't seem that we're obviously doing Patanjali's yoga, and then we look at what he's aiming for, which is basically to use asana and pranayama as sense restraints, just to control the senses, to restrain the senses. And we think, well, is that what we're really doing in the world? Just kind of restraining our senses and wanting to exit the world. I mean, this is the main thing that I keep coming back to, is that probably one could say pre-20th century, we don't find yoga used, whether it's classical yoga of Patanjali or tantric yoga, which I'm going to get onto in a minute. We don't find it used in any form or fashion as a world endorsing, as a body positive and world endorsing, really, philosophy, right? It's really to transcend the world, transcend the suffering of the world. And if you look at Patanjali, he very clearly says it on a number of occasions. The world is basically suffering, and the aim is to get out of it as soon as possible. So hands up, who's doing that in the modern yoga practice, right? We're using yoga. I mean, and all of us, right? If we're not in a monastery or somewhere in the Himalayas just practicing for salvation, we're using yoga to feel better about ourselves, about the world, about our place in the world, now, in the current world and not another world, right? So this discordancy, this difference between modern yoga and pre-20th century yoga, and, Krishnamacharya is really thinking along similar lines, I think, although he certainly does use yoga on a practical level as well. Nevertheless, we'll come back to that in a minute. We certainly don't see any talk of vinyasa then Patanjali, right? And vinyasa, as I mentioned before, I think in the previous podcast, is a term not made up by Patanjali, not made up by Krishnamacharya. Too many names here. But it certainly is him that uses vinyasa, first of all, to signify a moving flow of postures. Previous to that, I think vinyasa is a Sanskrit word used previously, but it dictates getting the parts of the ritual in order, and I think it's more to do with use of mudra. It's not meaning a dynamic yoga practice and handstands, etc. Right? Anyway, I'll come back to that in a minute. So I think one thing we can say, although that we can't say with Patanjali that we're just kind of doing these static asanas, which essentially is, in a static asana, if you think about the meaning of doing so, of employing oneself in a still position, it's really to say, in a world of change, in a world of constant movement, I don't embrace that. I'm distancing myself. I'm separating myself from the world, right? To take a static form of, a non-moving position. And then a moving position is immediately saying something to do with joining the world or using the world or embracing even the world, right? So this we can see in the movement traditions, modern movement traditions, that increasingly become more fluid and flowing as they become more worldly orientated. Yeah. So when Patanjali is using static asanas, it's to separate body and mind, right? The mind being off in some other realm as the body sits there on the carpet, and to separate body and mind from the world. In no uncertain terms, as I said, the world, up until fairly recently, is meant to be, or is seen as a place of suffering that you want to escape as soon as you can. and there's the same in I say semi-modern philosophy. I often think of Hobbes, the British philosopher, says, I can't remember his first name now. Hobbes. Anyone tell me? Life is nasty, brutish, and short. So I suppose up until more recently, suffering is very obvious in life. And when people look at life, up until, as I say, more recently, when we're able to kind of use technological advances to cover over the suffering of life, right? Death, disease, problems, suffering, the fact of even killing other animals, often for our own good, and the environment. We don't necessarily have to see the suffering entailed in life all the time. Yeah. But up until recently we did, because we weren't able to cover that over with technological inventions and middlemen, i.e. screens and old people's homes and hospitals and abattoirs, etc. Right? We see all this suffering, and it doesn't really, if you look at it point blank, I hate to be cynical here, but it doesn't seem to weigh up moments of happiness, moments of suffering, right? So the obvious understanding for any philosopher was, the only remedy here is to somehow transcend this, or somehow escape it, right? So this is the plan up until recent times, and yoga is hooked in accordingly to help us with that plan, right? So I think first and foremost, we have to be clear. If what we're doing now is worldly orientated, whether rightly or wrongly, right? And I include myself, and I think even well-esteemed yoga teachers and philosophers around us, though, we're all now practicing, essentially for this life. I think not for the next. Although, I'd say some also have metaphysical leanings. Nevertheless, we can say the broad strokes, yoga is now for the present, for the current, and not for future incarnations, right? How many, as Daniel Simpson, I think, said, how many of us are practicing for rebirth? And that's what Patanjali was looking for a better rebirth, and finally for exit altogether. So, Patanjali does have some, it's not like he's useless, and we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Patanjali talks about Dharma, as the Bhagavad Gita does, and Patanjali talks about Dharma with the yamas and niyamas, essentially the yamas mainly, how to live a life that kind of will be rendered more satisfactory and more pain-free, right? Living according to certain principles, internal and external. So the external social principles are the yamas. The internal principles for how to conduct one's own inner business are the niyamas. And we could say that's the dharmic injunctions. And dharma is the basis of yoga philosophy, actually. I mean, I think many different definitions have been banded around and discussed, right? Yoga is basically on transformation. Yoga is, I don't know, but I suppose what I would say is that it always surprises me that Dharma is the essence. Actually, if you come down to the essence of yoga philosophy, that living life in accordance to certain universal principles, that there are certain objective principles in life that have to be followed. You can't just make your own laws up, right? Like I think in the modern day of relativism, right, that everything is up for grabs, right? There's no objective principles. Everything is relative to the person. Everything is relative to the circumstances. That people can live life in any way and be happy. It depends on them. That's basically relativism. Right? Depends on you. Like if you like that, if that makes you happy, then do that and you'll be happy. No, yoga says no, you won't be. There's certain ways to live. There's certain ways to conduct yourself. There's certain ways and attitudes towards the world that are objectively happy or objectively going to make you satisfied with life, and there are other ways that are going to objectively cause you pain. So this is what is moral objectivism. Is it moral objectivism? Well, it's certainly not moral relativism, and that's the basis. This Dharma is the basis of yoga philosophy then, and I suppose you could say it's the basis of many religions, really, but we'll come to that later in terms of why yoga is not a religion, perhaps, if we get time. To dig myself out of that one. But anyway, Dharma is the basis of yoga philosophy, and certainly Patanjali talks about that. So it's not like we're not doing anything to do with classical yoga, because the classical yoga period, say roughly around the Aryan civilization, classical yoga comes from the Vedas, from the Rig Vedas, probably to around the 8th century, when tantric, when the medieval period takes over, right? So it includes such texts as the Bhagavad Gita, the Yoga Sutras, Brahma Sutras, many of the Upanishads, right? This is classical period, and classical period is, as I said, based on this rather negative worldview and the wish to transcend it, and use of Dharma and well, there's asana. There's talks of asana in the Bhagavad Gita as well. There's talks of asana in Yoga Sutras, but not really, in any way, shape or fashion, a dynamic asana practice. More just taking, in Bhagavad Gita, you'll see many passages, taking a seat in a quiet place, hold the spine erect. Perhaps you're sitting on a tiger skin or there's often mention of a deer skin or something, and you're in a quiet place, you're breathing, you're focusing on the tip of the nose. Then the Bhagavad Gita explains that this process of asana well, and it's basically meditation. It's basically taking a posture of meditation, right? So an as, again, is a seat of meditation, and controlling the mind on one point, right? So again, in broad strokes, well, if we define yoga as the whole lifestyle, and what we're doing is not just simply exotic gymnastics, right? That is, that's based on a whole lifestyle of trying to be more aware than less aware, right? And it's based on, so, in general context, the yoga practice we're doing is based on being more aware in life and not less aware. And then in more specific context, the yoga, so that's Dharma. In the most specific context, yoga is based on concentration, ekagrata vritti, one-pointed vritti, one-pointed state of mind. So still a vritti, right? Still a mind state, but trying to get into that one-pointed concentrated state of mind, right? And coming back to, we talked about how to define yoga, and I was stumped after this offering other definitions, right? Other than yoga is this appreciation, this understanding of Dharma. Well, yoga is really a question of trying to build a greater awareness around the understanding of Dharma. Right? So there's dharmic laws, right? And yoga is, and we're trying to follow those dharmic laws, right? But then the yoga method is based on trying to engender a better state of mind in which to understand those dharmic laws, so you're not just following them, so they're intuitively grasped, understood, right? So this is the point of yoga. Oh, I'd say all through the millennium, actually, to build awareness. And what's the awareness of? The natural laws of reality, right? So that's maybe a better definition, right? So, it does go back to the basis of Patanjali. Sure, I'm not going to throw Patanjali out or speak bad of Patanjali, come on. But nevertheless, what I want to say is that this kind of view of Patanjali, that it's just sense withdrawal, right? You sit in a position, withdraw the senses, and try and get into that chitta vritti nirodha, a non-mind, basically no mind, right? So that doesn't seem to be what we're looking for in modern yoga. We're trying to, I'd certainly say that we're trying to live more in unity and connection with the world rather than in less connection with the world, right? And the chitta vritti nirodha, well, that, people will say, well, that's just about peace of mind, and it's not really the wish to transcend the mind altogether. You just want to get into a more balanced mind state, and when we can, and be more centered and more, really look at the commentary. That's not really what Patanjali's saying. He is saying, and I hate to say it, but he really is saying, your job is, if you want to follow this kind of method I'm teaching you, is to transcend your mind, even to transcend not only the reality that you can perceive, but the reality altogether. It is going to that place of kind of, I want to say nihilism, not exactly negation, utter negation of consciousness in a way, right? And that's why I suppose I often come back to this idea that we're more doing something tantric, because a later medieval period we come up with tantra, which is also in the end going to that place, but in the meantime kind of using and working with body energy. I suppose I'm going to come back to that in a second, because now we're getting complicated, aren't we? Anyway, just so you know, Patanjali definitely is talking about that mind negation, the chitta vritti nirodha, the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind. And the fluctuations of the mind are our reality, right? Like, that's our self as we know it, that's our consciousness. We understand the world between differences, right? So hot and cold, tall and small, light and dark. These are fluctuations of the mind. If we don't have fluctuations of the mind, the world no longer exists, right? In other words, if we can't judge one thing against the other, if we have no differentiation process, for all intents and purposes, that's what Patanjali is saying. And, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I think it's good to know it. But, are we doing that now? It doesn't mean that we can't use him, just that we have to be clear about what he is saying and therefore what yoga, originally is. Otherwise, we do slip into that danger of appropriating yoga and kind of making, because we can make yoga what we would like it to be, following the on of there are dharmic laws and that we're trying to increase awareness. But we risk appropriating it if we just try and turn the essential kind of basis of some of the teachings into other things to suit our own means, right? Like, Patanjali is just saying we need a calmer mind. He's not saying, it doesn't mean that, we have to reject yoga. It just means we have to also be clear of the evolution of yoga. Otherwise we just say, yoga means this, or, yoga, but it doesn't, it has meant a number of slightly varied things, but we ought to be clear of what they are, and then we can decide on define where we want to fit in with that yoga, right? So anyway, coming back to Patanjali, he has, he's speaking to the monks. He's speaking to monks. If you look at the yamas, they are dharmic laws if we treat them kind of pragmatically, but you could also say if you treat them literally, they're monks' laws, brahmacharya, celibacy, poverty, aparigraha is non-hoarding, non-grasping, poverty, yeah. So, these are, ahimsa really, if you think about life and, if the first principle of ahimsa is impossible unless you literally seal yourself away in a monastery. If you're just walking down the street, turning on a light, buying something from the shops, you're committing harm to someone somewhere, right? All our pleasures, sad to say, are on the back of other people suffering to different degrees. Doesn't mean we want them to suffer to cause ourselves pleasure. It just means that's the way life is, right? So, true ahimsa can only be done if you are in a cave and like a Jain, like brushing the earth before you and eating. I mean, in the end, Jains kind of say, they only eat the stuff that's fallen from trees, and and even pulling up a root is a harm to the right. So true ahimsa, if you're living in the world, is impossible. And again, this kind of, if you look at Patanjali in the clear light of day, like in terms of looking at his commentary and what he actually wanted to say, and then we look at our own practices and we think, are we doing that? Even we're living in the world in the first place and we're not monks. So maybe we need another text, right? Maybe we need something else to do as well. Not that we can't glean anything from Patanjali, right? Trying to gain one-pointed awareness, trying to live according to some certain rules, understanding that, ego is a bit of a difficulty, and that it comes, and the ego is defined by desire and aversion, right? Ego really, if you look at yourself and your personality, it doesn't kind of exist. This is interesting, I think, and I came to it. Well, I probably didn't come to it myself, but I came to the right realization. I feel myself, the ego doesn't exist unless if you don't have any preferences in terms of if you don't like certain things and dislike other things. Ego kind of, imagine it being in that state, so you wouldn't have a sense of that kind of personality anymore, which you're used to, right? If you didn't have any likes or dislikes, right? So we really define ourselves around desire and aversion. So again, you've got, sorry, I forget the exact quote of Patanjali now. Sorry, guys. Asmita raga devesha abhinavesha klesha. So it's, so the ego is defined by the ignorance, right? Is defined by ego, and that's defined consequentially by desire and aversion. And these are the poisons, right? And the first is ignorance, just not knowing, not understanding reality. So again, we come back to this idea that, in order to understand the reality that we're in, to live according to Dharma, these objective rules in the world, and to fit ourselves into living according to reality. Because if you imagine the problem with not living according to reality is you're constantly swimming against the tide, right? Constantly trying to live in a world where stuff is happening and you're thinking one way and doing one thing, and the world is doing another thing, and you're just constantly battling against reality, and you feel like it's a cognitive dissonance, right? You're expecting life to be one way and it's actually another way, and therein comes pain, through these expectations of life, and it's not realistic. They're not realistic, right? So understanding that, realistically the way life is the first challenge, and then and the mistake or the ignorance is not understanding the way life is. It's not, it's nothing more, nothing less. And that's based on this mistaken idea of an individual self, and that's based on these preferences, which are arbitrary. If you think of your likes and dislikes, we do this just to, I think, in the end, just to create a sense of self. We like certain things, we don't like other things, and in the end, we kind of end up believing them, right? and that we all believe this story that we, because it's told to us as well, as we grow up, we kind of are almost helped make our personalities by our parents saying, oh, this is you like this, you're like this, and then we kind of, we develop this as we get older, and we run with it, we take the ball and run with it. We build up more and more of these likes and dislikes, and more rigidity against the world, really, because we have this kind of very heavy and solidified sense of self, trying to hold that firm against the world of change, and the world doesn't necessarily want to corroborate us. Anyway, I took a bit of a tangent there. I'm sorry about that. But what I wanted to say again is that just the idea of Dharma, we come back to, and this is classical yoga. We're going to go on to tantric yoga in a second. And this is the basis of what we could call yoga philosophy. No, we could call it Hinduism, but that's a modern term, right? And it's also related to culture. So I'll use the ambiguous term yoga philosophy. But again, it's based on there is an objective way to live, that makes life satisfactory, despite all the suffering in the world. Yeah, despite the world is suffering, you can still find a way to live that is adequate in life. And this is done by living according to Dharma, but, understanding those rules from the inside. So you're not just following them, because just following them kind of works, but, you need to know why as well. You need to, and that's through building up a yoga practice, basically, through building up a practice of awareness, which is a practice of awareness and concentration. Yeah. And Patanjali is doing that for sure. And he's talking about tapas, and he's talking about, the discipline, the consistent discipline, and then self-study, svadhyaya, and ishvara pranidhana, that essentially at the end of the day, you've got to give yourself over to perspective of a higher reality, whether that's a universal self, or that, I don't know. I mean, that's a tough one, isn't it? But a sense of something greater than one's individual self, right? So it's tapas, svadhyaya, ishvara pranidhana, but you've got to do something concerted for this awareness to come, right? So I'm making it complicated a bit in a way, but you can see I'm circling around a really simple principle as well, which is there and unites yoga from the start. So to say that yoga's changed, which I often say it has, it's evolved over the centuries, well, it has, and it hasn't, because you can see the roots of Patanjali are the same as well. Of course, he's not doing this dynamic asana, so that's where we get stuck. It's like, why are we doing this dynamic asana? Why don't we just sit in meditation and focus, like in the Bhagavad Gita, the same, or Yoga Sutras, just focus in a secluded place for a periods of time on our breathing and on holding the spine erect. That's always been essential, right? Straightening the spine. So we find that consistent with modern yoga. Spinal extension is the basis of modern yoga, how to elongate the spine. It's always elongating, whether it's elongating in a flexed way, in a rounded way, whether it's elongating in a back bend or a forward fold, there's still spinal elongation, right? Something to do with that. Yeah. So that's there. That's certainly there. But there's not all this modern kind of, when I say modern, I mean dynamic asana, the vinyasa aspect of it. Why is that there? And how do we link that back to Patanjali then? How do we justify saying that we're doing anything to do with the Yoga Sutras? Why do we look at the Yoga Sutras, not the Tantric texts, for example? Because, I mean, in many respects, I think the Tantric texts do give more of a guidance on what we're doing and when we're using the body for, hours at a time. I don't think, it doesn't seem like, anyway, just extrapolating that Patanjali was talking about doing hours of just asana practice. It was just sitting in an asana and meditating, right? So if we are doing these hours of asana practice, is there a reason for it? Or have we just gone on a big wild goose chase because we love our body now and, increasingly like identifying with our body, and have we kind of just branched off into something which is, kind of almost contrary to yoga? Well, maybe, but maybe not, because there's certainly a precedent for using our body in tantric yoga based on breath and bandha. And yeah, I mean, there's certainly there. And finally around, I think it's, people always correct me, but I think around, let's say the 7th century, you find the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra as the first kind of real text detailing a hatha yoga method, a method of hatha, force, of using the body. And so we're using the body now, not just denying the body, as Patanjali, hold the body still and deny it and go into a higher realm of solely ideals and mind states, right? But now in the tantric ideal, we're finding a method there's not just a body negative, it's body positive. It's in some respects, let's say, as a caveat there. But it's, it is using the body to say that the body can be a valid vessel of knowledge, not just simply a distraction from knowledge, right? So then in tantric, it's like, well, Now you read the Hatha Yoga Pradipika and the Shiva Samhita and the Garuda Samhita and the Ashtavakra Gita and the Yoga Bija and all these tantric texts. And there's many of them, right? There's many of them. And you read them all, though. They say very similar things in a way. And then again, it's like somewhat one is deflated again because you kind of think, well, yes, there's Bandha. There's talks of Bandha. Uddiyana's there, Jalandhara, Mula Bandha. And it talks of breathing. But the breathing is a pranayama and the Bandha is very heavy and the postures are fairly few, really. And when they're dynamic, they're, as in the Pradipika, they're said to cure diseases, and then they're also said to cure all diseases. So it seems highly unlikely that doing Mayurasana, peacock is always mentioned. Hatha Yoga Pradipika, I remember. It is mentioned, and then in other ones as well, as curing all diseases. It's like, come on. Come on. So that seems unfounded. And those postures, the more dynamic ones, are there just for health, right? So to prepare one to do this more esoteric practice, which is just sitting, doing basically what's often referred to as Mahaveda, Mahabandha, Mahamudra. Three practices which look very similar to me, to be honest. Well, one is banging up and down the coccyx to try to awaken the kundalini, but the other two seem similar, which are basically kind of like sitting in a rough Jalu-Shirshasana position, if you can imagine, with one leg tucked in and the other leg straight, and engaging all bandhas, and then doing a rather heavy or intense form of pranayama. So it's like, well, to raise the kundalini up through the central channel, to raise the prana from the prana, the energy of the body, to put that into the Sushumna Nadi, the spine, and to raise it up through the spine to the crown of the head, right? Sahasrara chakra, the crown of the head chakra, and to essentially exit out of the crown of the head chakra, which is a kind of yoga death. So similar again with Patanjali, we come around to this kind of rather morbid use of yoga at the end to try and exit the world. Again in Tantra, right? In the meantime, you can kind of have fun, right? Tantra allows you to have siddhis if you want, special powers. You can enjoy powers over the world through doing all these, the static, it's still static, right? But they're asanas, more asanas, up to 84 in some of the tantric texts, I think, are mentioned. But yeah, again, I mean, 84, I think is correct me if I'm wrong, the Garuda Samhita mentions 84, describes very much less. I think describes generally 11 or 12. Very few. Hatha Yoga Pradipika, I think, describes, correct me if I'm wrong, around 17. Again, most of them are meditational positions or not exactly demanding positions like we find in modern yoga. And if they are, like Mayurasana, there's a couple of more demanding postures that you couldn't exactly meditate in. They're said to be there for health. And when it says health, though, not just body health, we can't exactly find a precedent there. Oh, Mayurasana is good for the abdomen. It's like, no, it destroys all diseases. So, well, kind of a disappointment for me. I'm reading more closely tantric texts because you think, oh, okay, it starts to make sense, right? These texts start to talk about bandha and breathing and raising energy, certain energy. But, when they start to talk about more esoteric things like awakening the kundalini through the spine and, piercing the chakras, and you'll hear these sounds and experience these things, you start to think, well, again, I'm not doing that either in modern practice, right? So what am I doing now? And, well, it has to be said that modern yoga, post 20th century, is modern yoga, really. Again, it's a kind of somewhat, has precedence. It certainly has precedence in older traditions, but it doesn't really have any exact literal precedent, right? As much as we'd like to, it doesn't quite fit. Just like Patanjali doesn't quite fit. But, and this is the big caveat, we can use these texts and we can use these ideas to find a modern interpretation of what we're doing, right? I mean, if you take them literally, right? If you take Patanjali literally as as his word says, right? Then you can't do it, right? This is for monks, as I say. Literal ahimsa, literal brahmacharya, right? Literal poverty, aparigraha, right? Literal chittavritti nirodha, right? Stopping of the senses, right? That is beyond pale, as we say in English. It doesn't work. But if you look at it more, understand. And if you don't, this is not appropriation, right? If you understand the original context, and then if you say, well, how can we use the basic wide sweeping principles of yoga, i.e. Dharma, belief in some kind of objective nature, and the belief that if we raise our consciousness, if we raise our awareness, we can live better according to the state of our actual reality, inside and outside, right? these are the basic principles of yoga. And if we then, keeping them in mind, adapt and interpret some of these texts for the modern context, then it's not appropriation. But if we don't recognize that we have adapted, that's what I suggest, that it is an appropriation, right? So we are adapting Patanjali, right? Because we're not living in a monastery now. So we have to take that in mind, right? We're not probably going to be celibate, or probably want no possessions, right? So, or probably want to stop the mind, right? Or probably want to get rid of the individual sense of self altogether, right? I suggest if we're living in this world, we need an ego. We don't want. It would be very unsmart to get rid of an ego and live in this world at the same time. I think that'll be a rather precarious situation, right? So anyway, similar with Tantra, we can't just take it literally, because if we take it literally, then it's, let's say, well, are we really waking the Kundalini to pierce all the channels and liberate ourselves from this body and have all these? I mean, read the text by all means, and having all these crazy experiences. Is that really what we're aiming for? Well, if we're honest, probably it's unlikely. Probably we don't really feel that that's what we're doing in an everyday yoga practice, right? So what are we doing? And let's say in some ways that the let's say the field is open, right? The slate is a clean slate to start again, but in other ways it's not. I mean, because if we are doing yoga, it's based on these fundamental ideas. And if we're doing hatha yoga, the yoga of force, half force, I think I mentioned that earlier, right? Some actual method, not just a meditational method, but some forceful method, i.e., of the body, right? If we're doing something like that, then we have to say, well, we are doing something which does have precedence, and yeah, it's related to tantric yoga as well. I mean, albeit we're not raising the Kundalini, we're certainly trying to gather our prana. We're trying to gather our energy to let's say metaphorically, gather our energy into our core. When we talk about being more grounded, more centered, more with more integrity, even, right, with more authenticity, right? It's to be more ourselves. We're gathering our energy, which is dispersed outwards, like when we try to copy or look to other people for our opinions and beliefs and ways to act, right? Or when we bring our strength and our, conviction, our sense of conviction about ourselves to our center, and say, well, this is gathering our prana in our central channel, maybe, right? For example, right? And you can do that with the yoga practice, which is centering. It's the physical yoga practice, of asana. It's a very centering, grounding, focused practice. Yeah. And it develops awareness, right? Inevitably, it develops awareness. And if you use that in a sensible manner, right, not just kind of go out and then just do whatever you fancy, it informs the rest of your life. And certainly it helps these days, I think, to develop a certain lifestyle, which I think is the most important thing of the practice of facts. That develops a kind of yoga lifestyle around what you're doing, right? That you go to bed at a sensible hour, that you think, well, I want to get on the mat tomorrow, so I'm going to look out for my diet, and I'm not going to smoke and drink and all the things that basically get in the way of being able to do this practice, which makes me feel good throughout the day. So although that maybe the carrot at first is, well, I feel good throughout the day and it makes me feel good and centered, and and not just good in terms of like I've done a workout, but good in terms of I feel there's something going on here. I feel it's cleansing my mind as well. This concentration, this because you don't get that, say, at the gym or kicking a football around, right? So you feel like that, and it's a pleasurable experience. It's still very much an experience of the ego, but then you kind of think, well, I'm going to do all these other things around my life then to continue having this experience, because awareness feels rather good. And then you start building up this whole lifestyle, which is based on the kind in a way then a kind of sense withdrawal, then, isn't it? So it's a kind of pragmatic kind of interpretation of older precedents in a modern manner, right? So it's like, and I think we have to be aware, otherwise again we start appropriating what it was then, what they said then. I think it's good and respectable to be aware of that, but then what we're doing now in the modern interpretation of these texts, otherwise we're lost. If we take these texts on face value, even Bhagavad Gita, I would say, certainly Yoga Sutras and most tantric texts, they're kind of useless to us, right? Because we're not doing that, right? But we're not stopping the mind, or we're not raising Kundalini and having all these kind of esoteric and crazy experiences. But if we start to interpret them sensibly, I mean, I say sensibly, but pragmatically, in terms of doing a modern practice, because it's like, well, we want to do this modern practice. It makes us feel good, and we take it from there. Okay, so why, why are we doing it? Well, we could say, well, it was given to us by Krishnamacharya, and I mentioned the principle of vinyasa that he and others around that time as well. There's a few, funnily enough, often happens that there's a few innovators, Shu Yogendra, Krishnamacharya, as I mentioned on the last podcast, Kavalyananda, Swami Kavalyananda, and a few others, right, that are kind of innovating modern dynamic asana at that time. And we say, well, they just gave us it and that's what we're doing now. But no, we want to be doing that now. So why is that? Well, we want a further connection with the world in a certain manner. So it's just like understanding the modern context of what we want out of our experience, which is not to say that it cannot also be done within the objective principles of reality. I think it's just like, well, we'd rather do it in life rather than outside life now. Well, you could say, well, life is suffering, like essentially, like all life is suffering. Well, that will knock the nail on the head. If you really do take that view of classical yoga, then I think that's the ultimate thing that we have to admit that has changed, right? If we're looking to embrace life, we have to admit that there is that this is the one thing that we could say would differentiate us from a pre-20th century yoga tradition. Yeah, I mean, reflecting on it in all honesty now, But everything else is the same. They're raising awareness, living according to certain principles, and then latterly the tantric ideas of energy in the body, one-pointed concentration. All this stuff is, it's going on exactly the same as what we want today, I believe, and why we're doing it today. But this one thing about trying to escape the suffering of reality, which, even as I say, even the Tantra, I mean, I wanted to think for a while that Tantric was a way of embracing the body and embracing all of because Tantric essentially, in the modern iteration anyways, is saying, well, you can embrace mind states and emotional states and work with them rather than just reject, right? Classical yoga is all about neti rejection of any experience, right, for the void. And tantric yoga in broad strokes, again, to let myself off the hook for experts, tantric yoga in broad strokes is saying, well, actually we can go into these states, we can work with them, we can understand them, because life is about feeling, life is about texture, life is about experiencing in the pure state all these different emotions. There's nothing inherently wrong with them. The problem is simply that they're not being dealt with in a skillful or effective manner, right? So if you can imagine the beauty of sadness, for example, or the power of pure anger, right, which is not confused with confusion or jealousy or malevolence or aggression, right? All these things are beautiful and strong, so they're not to be rejected. This is tantric idea, but in the end they are, again, because in the end what tantric is, the tantric text of yoga anyway, are suggesting is that you use the body, use the energy of the body, and essentially still to transcend it into a mind state, that's why Raja Yoga, the yoga of meditation, is always pretty much involved in tantric texts. And in the end, you go into the yoga of meditation, as in the Hatha Yoga Pradipika as well. You go into Raja Yoga, you work with Raja Yoga. If you don't work with Raja Yoga, basically it says, you're not doing yoga. You have to use Hatha Yoga with Raja Yoga. They have to go together. It's just that at this time, in the tantric area, you need to do some bodily practices as well. You can't just sit there anymore. You have to do something physical, right? But in the end, you're still doing the same thing. You're going to an idealistic, it means a realm of ideals, a mental realm, and you're exiting the body, right? So, nevertheless, you're getting to the same place in the end. So, where does that leave us? Well, as I said, the one discrepancy is that we have to say we're doing a dynamic practice. That doesn't necessarily disclude the possibility of having an older precedent. But if we're doing a dynamic practice for this world and not the next, then we've got to say, this is a modern thing. This is a modern thing to use yoga for this life only. And we start to see these kind of, I don't think Krishnamacharya fully believed that, but we start to see this kind of discourse with the modern teachers where they're saying, they're talking about the benefits in modern life, and they're not talking about God anymore. They're not talking about necessarily about realization of reality and disappearing into the Brahman, merging with the Brahman. They're talking to the ego, they're talking to the individual about being a better individual and ego. So, where does that leave us in the modern practice? Well, I think that that question I throw back to you. What are you doing now? As a way to avoid it, in a way, but no. As I say, we've got a lot of precedents in the prior text, but they're not exactly the same. And And also, I mean, when we look at modern yoga with Krishnamacharya, for example, look at Makaranda again. Makaranda, you've got to read that. A great book. What he's doing is kind of, like, as I'm doing now, he's kind of merging the Ashtanga yoga of Patanjali with modern tantra, and merging the two. One point he's saying yoga is for meditation, for sense control, and it's about regulating breath, so you experience a clarity of consciousness. And the other point he's saying, there's energy in the body, and you're trying to work with this energy to produce a particular experience that's understood in the body. And you constantly see this synthesis in Krishnamacharya, and it's carried on to the modern era, because obviously we're doing this dynamic practice, which suggests to me that we want connection with the world rather than holding ourselves against the world. And also, we have to say that our aspirations are, if we weren't experiencing anything positive on a daily level, put it this way, we probably wouldn't continue. We probably wouldn't doing this like an old religious penance. You do it. The more you suffer, the more you think, oh yeah, rub your hands together, you're going to get a better life next time. We wouldn't do it nowadays, and I think rightly so. And we're in a scientific based reality where we want to see results. We don't just want to have, as we say, blind faith. We just have, just this hope for that heaven exists or a better rebirth exists after us. We want to see practical and efficient results in our actual reality that are measurable. I say, like, I feel better in a sense of I feel more clear, I feel more grounded, I feel more likely to experience emotions of empathy and kindness and interest in other people, etc., right? Rather than selfishness, aggression, general malevolence and jealousy, etc. All those ones. And and this is how we judge our modern yoga practice. And it's a tricky one, because yes, in some ways it is an abrupt change of pace. But in other ways, when you read back to the text, you can say, well, we're actually doing a very similar thing, just in a more pragmatic way, right? But certainly, if we're just sitting in meditation in one asana, we can say, and we're hoping for exiting the world and a better rebirth, we can say we're doing Patanjali. Or if we're sitting and we're using heavy pranayama, heavy bandha, and trying to raise our kundalini for this kundalini awakening, then we're doing tantra. But if we're not doing either of those things, and we're doing this modern flow, which is body-centered generally, it might not involve meditation, might not involve pranayama, right? Then, well, we have to question what we're doing now, and don't need an answer. I mean, I'm still questioning it now. But as I suggested, the answer that comes to me is that it's grounded in a bigger proposition, which is to understand one's relationship between the inner world that we all live in and the outer world, which we have to live in, right? What's the difference? What is this? What are the two things? What does the inner and the outer mean, and how do they relate to each other? And that's that same old question of this in the basic foundation of Indian philosophy, Dharma, and then Atman and Brahman. So there's a certain way to live, and this way to live is related to the relationship between the universal, right, the universal consciousness that makes up everything, and the individual version of that, which you're experiencing right now, right? And the relationship of the two and the satisfactory resolution of the two together, where the one understands the other, right, and what it is truly, is the nature of yoga. And that is defined by raising awareness, and the method is one-pointed concentration. So you can see we're doing a similar thing, but nevertheless, the method is different, and perhaps the aim is ultimately different as well, right? We're not aiming for God or merging into the absolute, probably. So the aim is different. So yeah, I mean, I'm not expecting to answer this question in one podcast, as you can imagine, and I hope I've been clear or had lucid moments in the less lucid moments of this subject, because it is a difficult one, and I haven't, I suppose, got my head around exactly what it is that one is doing. Because if we knew what we were doing in practice, I suppose then we wouldn't need to practice, right? The whole point is we practice because we don't know fully, we're not clear about our lives, so we practice to know what practice is, in a sense, right? To come back to the start and know that the destination for the first time, right? Anyway, a few little musings from me, and next week you'll be joined by a more sensible guest, we hope. But I hope you found it interesting. And as I say, we don't need to have a resolution on this conversation, but just keep answering the question in your own practice. What it's the same as the Ramana Maharishi question: who am I? Right? Or that's that same. what is going on here? You could say is a more common, colloquial idiomatic way of saying it. What is going on here? What's the purpose of all this? Right? Same old question. Right? And that question was asked, 2,500 years ago by yoga. We're still asking it today. Perhaps we come up with different resolutions, slightly, but I think as long as the question is there and the means is awareness, right? And the means is awareness of some objective principles, like i.e., you can't just kind of decide whatever yoga means for you, right? It means drinking beer and doing it with goats. That's my yoga. It's like no. There's objective principles here. Right? But nevertheless, as long as you're doing those things, you're still doing yoga. But it's good to know the context as well. It's good to know what the text did mean, and then we can say, well, how we've kind of modified them now, so we're aware that we're not actually appropriating them altogether. Anyways, thanks for listening. And if you want to join me somewhere, then please do look at the schedule. And I'd love to see you, and we can talk more about this. And I'll try and do some more yoga modules and seminars on the workshops I'm doing in the future. Right? If you like the podcast, don't forget to subscribe and do the liking and the commenting on iTunes or wherever you're listening to it. And I think that really helps a lot with the ratings. And we're still trying to reach out to more viewers, right? If you think it's relevant, if you've learnt anything or had your mind piqued at all, had your mind stimulated at all by this, then maybe do that. That'll be a great gift to me. Anyway, I'll see you next week for another episode of Keen on Yoga. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.